The air outside the stadium was warm, pulsing with the nervous energy of graduation day. Families clutched floral bouquets and camera phones. Security guards nodded stiffly at the gates. And Jasmine stood still. She wasn't wearing a cap. No academic gown draped her shoulders. No cords, no tassel. Just a sleeveless black dress, tailored sharp, and a look that didn't blink. "Ma'am," said the security officer again, this time louder, "I'm sorry, but unless you're a student or faculty in proper attire, we can't let you in." Jasmine didn't respond. Her eyes scanned the edge of the crowd. She wasn't shocked. She wasn't confused. She was calculating. "It's a security protocol," the guard added, shrugging as if the rules somehow absolved the discomfort of enforcing it. A mother passed by, beaming, holding her graduate son's arm. Someone shouted, "Go Eagles!" from the far side of the parking lot. Jasmine still said nothing. She turned, stepped back from the line, and walked away. Not fast, not defeated, just different. What happened in the next 30 minutes didn't just resolve a tense public moment. It exposed something deeper about power, dignity, and truth in America. If this kind of story keeps you listening, like the video, comment your state and local time, subscribe for more voices that won't be silenced. She had spoken on stages before, courtrooms, panels, auditoriums, but never like this, never with so many watching and so few knowing what was coming. The irony of being barred from the entrance to her own speech wasn't lost on her. It didn't sting, not in the way humiliation usually does. It just confirmed what she already understood too well. There are rules, and then there are expectations. And for people like Jasmine, those aren't always the same. Behind the bleachers, a service ramp led to the back of the stage. Two interns carried folding chairs up a narrow incline, chatting about student loans and TikTok trends. Jasmine stepped lightly into their blind spot, moving as if she belonged, because she did. Inside, the ceremony had begun. A jazz quartet played the alma mater in the key of nostalgia. University deans, draped in crimson and navy, processed in with stiff dignity. Parents squinted in the sun, waiting for names to be called, diplomas to be waved. Nobody noticed that the keynote speaker hadn't arrived from the front. Backstage, Jasmine passed a mirror without glancing at it. Her hair was pulled into a soft twist. No name badge, no lanyard. Just the rhythm of her steps echoing off concrete walls, measured and unbothered. A coordinator spotted her. "Oh, Miss Jasmine, thank God. We thought, you weren't..." "I'm here," Jasmine said, calm. No apology, no smile. The woman blinked, processing the dress. "We, assumed you'd come through the main..." "Never mind. You are mic'd in 3. Jasmine nodded, stepped onto the tape mark at stage left, waited. From the crowd, no one could see her yet. Only the announcer's voice carried, "And now it is our honor to welcome our keynote speaker, attorney, advocate, and alumna, Jasmine." The rest drowned in applause. And then she walked out. Not robed, not decorated, just exactly as she'd arrived. Visible, calm, intentional. A ripple moved through the sea of chairs. Someone in the third row gasped, "Wait, isn't that..." It was. The same woman who was told she couldn't come in without looking the part was now center stage. Hands wrapped lightly around the edges of the podium. Scanning a crowd that had no choice but to listen. The applause slowed, confused at first, then picked up again. Louder, carried by a recognition that had nothing to do with gowns or gates. She waited, not for quiet, but for stillness. "Before we begin," Jasmine said, "I want to thank the gentleman at the gate who reminded me what it feels like to be mistaken for an outsider. And I want to thank you all for being here anyway." A few laughs broke through, nervous, grateful ones. She continued, "I wasn't asked here to wear something. I was asked here to say something." Her voice wasn't theatrical. It was exact, every word earned. "Some of you arrived today with honors," she said. "Cords around your neck, medals in your pockets, families who flew in from 4 time zones." Pause. "But some of you came here the long way, through night shifts and eviction notices, through silence and survival, through professors who said, You're smart for someone like you." Her gaze moved across the rows. This speech isn't just for the ones who were seen. It's for the ones who had to see themselves first. She didn't name the security guard again. She didn't need to, because everyone watching could feel the weight of what had just unfolded. 10 minutes ago, she'd been denied an entry. Now she was the main event. And she hadn't yelled, she hadn't forced her way in, she had just shown up, on her terms. As she spoke, phones lifted, videos recorded. Someone whispered, "This is going to go viral," without knowing it already had, because every moment she stood there, bare shoulders, bare of regalia, was a quiet rebuke of the rules that almost erased her, and she was just getting started. The applause lingered like a hum beneath her words. Some students sat forward, elbows on knees. Others leaned back, wide-eyed, as if watching a story rewrite itself in real time. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't worn the badge, but she had everyone's full attention. And it wasn't because of her resume. It was because she looked like someone who'd just done something people weren't supposed to do. Cross a line meant to keep them out. Behind the stage, a faculty coordinator still whispered into a headset, "Yes, she's on now. Yes, I know she wasn't. Just let it play." They didn't have a backup speaker, and now they didn't need one. Jasmine continued, "You know, when I was a student here, I used to walk by this stadium and dream about this day. Not the gowns, not the cameras, just the idea that someone like me could one day return, not to ask permission, but to speak." A silence fell over the lawn. I never imagined that, even on the day I was invited to speak, someone might look at me and decide I didn't belong. The crowd shifted, eyes widened. The implication was landing. "But this isn't about me," she said, pacing slowly across the stage. "It's about how many people get told every day, in subtle and not so subtle ways, that they need to change how they look before they're allowed to lead." Her voice was soft but carried. "Some of you will leave this campus and find yourself in boardrooms where no one looks like you. Some of you will be asked if you're the assistant, the intern, the help." She let it hang. "And the hardest thing you'll ever do," she added, "is choose not to explain yourself." A murmur passed through the front rows. "You will be told to match the dress code, to read the room, to speak softer, sit straighter, smile more. You will be taught that blending in is safer than standing out, and sometimes you will believe them." She stopped walking, looked straight out into the graduates. "And then there will be a moment," she said, "a moment like the one I had this morning, when you're told, politely, even professionally, that you don't belong." A breeze picked up. She didn't flinch. "And you will have a choice, not about whether to scream or cry or argue, but about whether you let that moment define you or design you." A single clap rang out, then another. "You see," Jasmine said with a smile now just starting to break, "I didn't walk away from that gate because I was defeated. I walked away because I knew the front door wasn't built for me. But the message I came here to give," she paused, "doesn't need the front door to be heard." The crowd stirred, unsure if it was safe to erupt yet, still listening, still absorbing. "I entered from backstage," she said plainly. "No fuss, no fight, just a different route. And when I stepped onto this platform, what I felt wasn't victory, it was clarity." She looked out at the graduates, many of whom were now nodding quietly. A few wiped tears. One man in the third row, wearing a service member's stole, raised a fist and held it. "Because you can tell someone they don't belong all you want," Jasmine said. "But if they're meant to be there, eventually they'll show up anyway." Her tone shifted, lower now. "This world builds entire systems to measure worth by appearance, by polish, by tradition. But here's what they don't teach you in classrooms. Dignity doesn't require permission, and leadership has no uniform." A beat passed. Her hands rested lightly on the podium. "Don't dress for the room, dress for the moment." Another pause. "And if that moment demands that you stand alone, stand anyway." The applause that followed wasn't explosive. It was something deeper, sustained, layered, like a crowd realizing something they'd felt but never put into words. From the wings, a production assistant mouthed, "Wow," as Jasmine stepped back from the mic. She hadn't finished her speech. Not by a long shot, but the message had landed. In the audience, a young woman whispered, "That's her. She's the one they stopped at the gate." Her friend nodded slowly, pulled out her phone, and hit record just as Jasmine leaned into her next line. We live in a country that praises transformation, but often punishes visibility, especially when it comes from someone they weren't expecting, someone they didn't see coming. More heads turned. Some students pulled off their mortarboards to cool down. Others clutched them tighter. "The truth is," Jasmine said, "some rooms only open after you've already proven you don't need them." The screen behind her displayed her name, title, and a quote. "You don't need to dress like them to deserve to lead them." It wasn't part of her speech. Someone in tech had added it midstream, sensing the moment, and it fit perfectly. A professor in the front row tapped the arm of the dean. "She just saved our ceremony," he muttered. But Jasmine wasn't trying to save anything. She was there to speak, and she was only just beginning. By the time Jasmine took her next breath, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Not just polite attention, immersion. Students who'd been glancing at their phones were now gripping them, recording every word. Parents stopped whispering. Even the restless toddlers on their grandparents' laps went oddly still, as if something unspoken told them, "This moment matters." She looked down for a second, not to gather herself, but to let the silence stretch. "I don't know the name of the guard who stopped me this morning," she said, "but I do know the look in his eyes." Her voice stayed calm, almost gentle. It wasn't anger, it wasn't even meanness, it was certainty. He was certain I didn't belong. Certain that a woman in a black dress without robes or cords couldn't possibly be the reason this stage was here. A ripple of recognition passed through the crowd, an ache, familiar to too many. "And I don't tell you this to shame him," she continued. "I tell you because, at some point, you will face that same certainty from someone in a suit or a desk or a title. They will look you up and down and they'll decide where you fit." She let that hang. "And they'll be wrong." Applause swelled, heavier now, not just from students, but from faculty, some of whom were shifting in their seats, glancing nervously at the program booklets, as if wondering how they could have let this story unfold without them knowing. Jasmine waited. She wasn't rushing, she was steady, letting each truth settle before lifting the next. "We don't teach enough about systems in speeches like this," she said. "We teach stories of grit, of perseverance, of pulling yourself up. But we don't always talk about the gatekeepers." Her gaze swept the audience. "Today, I became my own gatekeeper. Not because I wanted to, but because no one else was going to open it for me." She stepped forward, away from the podium, closer to the edge of the stage. "And I'm telling you now, there are going to be moments when your silence will speak louder than your protest, when your presence will say more than your permission slip." A long breath. I walked in through the side door. No badge, no title announced. But let me tell you something I learned backstage. She turned slightly, gesturing to the curtains behind her. No one back there cared about what I was wearing. They just saw someone who looked like she knew where she was going. And that, sometimes, is all it takes. Students began clapping again, but it wasn't a cheer. It was a kind of yes, not loud, but full-bodied. "There's something strange about power," she said. "It often hides in rituals, in robes, in vocabulary designed to intimidate. But once you've seen past all that, once you've walked on stage without it and still held the room, you realize none of it ever made you worthy." She turned toward the students in the back rows, the ones furthest from the stage. "It's not the robe that makes the speech," she said. "It's the person inside it." And then came the moment. A voice, soft, unsure, called out from somewhere in the audience. "Can we get a picture?" There was laughter, light and spontaneous. Jasmine tilted her head, smiling with surprise. "Let me finish first," she said, hand to her heart. "But thank you, that means a lot." Someone else shouted, "You're trending!" And they weren't wrong. Just beyond the stadium gates, dozens of students who hadn't made it inside were gathered in groups, huddled around phones. A video taken earlier, grainy, vertical, but unmistakable, was spreading like wildfire. It showed the security guard, his words clear. You can't enter without regalia or ID. It showed Jasmine pausing, turning away without protest. And it cut to now her standing on stage, commanding the ceremony she'd been told she wasn't allowed to enter. The caption? She got blocked at the gate. Now she's giving the keynote. From block to keynote. By the time she reached the end of her next paragraph, the video had surpassed 100,000 shares. On TikTok, on Instagram, on Twitter, even on LinkedIn. And the thing was, she didn't even know yet. She just kept speaking. I'm not here to make anyone comfortable, she said. Comfort isn't the point. Truth is, more applause. Some were standing now. Because somewhere in this crowd is a student who almost didn't make it. Maybe your scholarship got cut. Maybe your car broke down. Maybe someone you loved told you it wasn't worth it. She scanned the crowd again. And now you're here. The wind picked up slightly, rustling tassels and flags. Jasmine stood firm. You made it here not because every door opened, but because you learned to walk around them, to pick the lock with grace, to carry yourself like you had nothing to prove until they realized you were the proof. At that, the students did rise, first in ones and twos, then in rows. The clapping became thunder. Some were crying, a few held hands. Faculty looked at each other, unsure what protocol even existed for a moment like this. But Jasmine didn't milk it. She let them rise. And then she said, don't let the ceremony fool you. This isn't a finish line. She stepped back to the mic. This is your first denied entry. Pause. And I hope you walk into every room after this the same way I did today, not asking if you're allowed, but knowing that you belong. She turned calmly and walked off stage. No robe, no approval, just presence. The moment she disappeared behind the curtain, the crowd didn't sit. They remained standing, clapping, not just because the speech was good. It was something else, something rarer. They had witnessed dignity unbent by spectacle. The dean of students, clearly flustered, stepped to the mic. Let's, one more round of applause for our keynote speaker, Jasmine. But the rest of his sentence was swallowed by another wave of cheers, louder this time, realer. Because in the span of 30 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had done what few ever manage. She hadn't just spoken truth, she embodied it in real time on their stage. From the back of the stadium, two students watched the scene unfold on a live stream from their phones. They had seen the TikTok first. Jasmine turned away, the security guard waving her off. They hadn't known who she was at first, but now, I can't believe that's the same woman, one said. The other just nodded. She didn't say a thing. She just showed up different. That clip, her being stopped at the gate, then appearing on stage 10 minutes later, had become the moment, the visual, the before and after that said everything. And it didn't need a narrator, just a caption. Power doesn't knock, it walks through. From block to keynote. Inside the university press box, the media team scrambled. A junior coordinator spoke into her headset, voice clipped. No, we don't have B-roll of her entering. She came in from back access. We're looking for student footage now. Yes, it's already viral. Yes, I know. Behind her, a monitor replayed the moment Jasmine reached the podium. Even muted, it hit hard. A producer leaned over. You think we could get her for the commencement reel? The coordinator just shook her head. At this point, she is the reel. Backstage, Jasmine sat alone in the green room. It was quiet. No one rushed in to congratulate her. No one ushered her out. She didn't need either. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on her knees, hands folded. She had said what she came to say. And the beauty of it? It wasn't just about her anymore. Students were flooding social feeds with their own stories. Snippets of what it felt like to be overlooked, questioned, doubted. Screens lit up with photos of classmates in borrowed gowns, mismatched shoes, name cards printed hours before the ceremony. The hashtag wasn't just celebration, it was vindication. One post read, I almost didn't go today, couldn't afford the regalia, thought I'd stick out. Then I saw her. She walked up there like the rules had never applied to her body, and I stood up because maybe they don't have to apply to mine either. From block to keynote, a nod. She didn't just speak, she entered like she belonged. No yelling, no ask, just presence. That's the protest. Jasmine checked her phone. Hundreds of notifications. Dozens of messages, screenshots, texts from friends and strangers. Some of them just one line. That was for me. And then a message from a professor she hadn't heard from in years. They won't remember who gave the diplomas. They'll remember you. She turned the phone over and let the stillness settle, but outside, that stillness was gone. Across the campus, students had begun gathering near the stage, not to leave, but to take pictures where Jasmine had stood. Not for selfies, not for vanity, for proof, because something had cracked open, just wide enough to feel like change. If that moment hit you too, don't just sit with it. Subscribe, not for us, but for the truth still being erased. And the security guard? He wasn't fired, no public reprimand. His name never made the headlines. But later that afternoon, someone filmed him standing just beyond the gates, looking out at the crowd that had once been on the other side of his authority. He didn't speak, just watched. Maybe he saw the phones pointed at Jasmine. Maybe he saw the girl who had entered without permission and left with a standing ovation. Or maybe for the first time, he realized that the rules he'd enforced weren't neutral, after all, because they never are. And on that day, one woman's quiet presence had exposed just how fragile those rules could be. By sundown, the footage had hit every platform. Morning news segments scrambled to cut together timelines. The 3-second clip of Jasmine being waved off at the gate, her pivot, her silence, her walk, was now stitched beside the crescendo of her standing center stage, unbothered, unmoved, unrobed. The split screen said everything. No music, no commentary, just a title. Before, after. From block to keynote. On campus, students gathered in small circles, earbuds shared, phones passed between palms like gospel. The official commencement hashtag had been eclipsed. The university's own post, "Congratulations to our class of 25," was flooded with thousands of quote comments. Y'all didn't even let her in the gate. The speech that wasn't supposed to happen. Hope this gets taught in your leadership class next semester. But for Jasmine, this wasn't new. What startled the institution was not the speech, it was the method of her entry. She hadn't forced her way through. She hadn't filmed herself in protest or demanded justice at the gate. She had simply found another way. And that, perhaps, was the hardest truth for people to digest. Because if you can be stopped by a rule that doesn't exist and still outshine the ones enforcing it, what does that say about the system? In a dorm just off campus, a group of first-generation students watched the video again. One girl, still in her gown, stared at the screen and whispered, "I didn't know we were allowed to do that." Her roommate looked up. "Do what?" She didn't blink. "Walk through the back." Across the quad, a junior in political science began composing a thread. This is about more than regalia. This is about who institutions are built to recognize and who they erase on sight. Underneath, she posted screen grabs of the university's dress code policy, nothing listed about mandatory robes for speakers. And yet, that had been enough to nearly block the most important voice of the day. Elsewhere, a graduate stood in line for photos and turned to her mother. "She made me feel like it was okay to be here without pretending, without shrinking." Her mother smiled, brushing a curl off her daughter's face. "You were always allowed to be here, you just needed someone to remind the room." Meanwhile, the school's PR department drafted statements, carefully worded, avoiding terms like mistake or bias, just vague acknowledgments of a miscommunication at the entrance. But no one was reading those posts. They were watching the video, and it kept spreading. By the next morning, it had racked up millions of views and been reshared by civil rights leaders, celebrities, educators, and journalists alike. The most repeated comment? She said more in her walk than most say in a lifetime of speeches. But the viral moment wasn't just about inspiration. It was also about exposure. Because suddenly other stories came out. Quiet ones. One student wrote, "I was almost turned away from my freshman orientation because they said my paperwork looked incomplete. I had everything printed, but I looked too young, too black, too poor to be here." Today, I watched Jasmine Crockett stand on that stage and remind me that none of that was about me. Another posted, "My older brother dropped out because a professor told him, 'This school isn't for people who need catching up.' He's watching that speech right now, and he's thinking about reapplying." Hashtag from block to keynote had become more than a hashtag. It was a mirror. People weren't just watching the moment. They were remembering their own. Somewhere in Atlanta, a high school student saved the clip to her phone. She didn't share it, didn't comment, but she watched it 3 times in a row, quiet, still. The last time she whispered aloud, "I won't ask next time." And that was the legacy Jasmine didn't need to design, only reveal. Because it wasn't the speech that changed people. It was the stillness before it. That moment where she stood in front of a guard, told she didn't belong, and said nothing. No fight, no spectacle, just a refusal to be reduced. Somewhere along the line, we forgot that protest can look like stillness. That reclaiming space doesn't always come with volume. Sometimes it comes with a quiet, unbroken gaze that says, "I've already earned this." And in Jasmine's case, the world watched her silence speak volumes. By the end of the week, universities across the country began reevaluating their entrance protocols. Not because Jasmine demanded it, but because silence doesn't end at the gate. It echoes inside the walls. She never named the guard. She never dragged the school. She didn't need to. The world saw the whole thing beginning to end, and for once, it couldn't look away. The university's official statement arrived 3 days later, a carefully worded press release, dense with phrases like regrettable incident, standard protocols, and commitment to inclusivity. It never said her name, never said sorry, but by then it didn't matter, because Jasmine Crockett had already rewritten the story without touching the mic, without demanding retraction, and without ever using the word victim. The real reckoning wasn't in the ceremony. It came after, in the ripple effect. In offices, in classrooms, in whispered conversations between faculty. What other rules had they been enforcing out of habit? What other thresholds had been designed without anyone noticing who got left on the other side? A student journalist for the campus paper published an editorial titled, "The dress code is a gate, not a guideline." It quoted past commencement speakers, one of whom had worn a blazer and jeans without issue, another who entered through the same gate holding a coffee and a bicycle helmet. Neither were questioned, neither were black women. The piece ended with a line that stopped readers cold. "Sometimes the uniform isn't required, it's just expected of certain people." And that was the question Jasmine had never even needed to ask aloud. Expected by whom? For whom? Across higher ed, administrators began rereading their own policies, this time with fresh eyes. The ones that had once seemed neutral, regalia required, credentials visible, entrances marked, now look like selective fences dressed up as order. And that's the thing about dignity. You can't standardize it, but you can absolutely deny it. And when you do, people notice. A sociology professor at the university held an impromptu class outside that week. She brought a speaker and played Jasmine's speech, unedited, uninterrupted. Her students, many of whom hadn't attended the ceremony, sat cross-legged on the grass. Halfway through, one student, a quiet sophomore, raised her hand and said, "It's not just what she said. It's how she didn't apologize for being right." The professor nodded. That's the part systems can't process. A woman of color who doesn't flinch, who doesn't soften herself for the room. That stillness, Jasmine's refusal to explain, to shrink, to perform humility for entry, it unsettled something deeper than dress codes. It cracked the illusion that power was always in the hands of those holding the clipboard. And that kind of clarity, it's contagious. In the weeks that followed, students across the country that started using the hashtag, not just to share the video, but to post their own stories, photos of turned away moments, dress code violations that only seemed to apply to black girls, behavior complaints rooted in posture, tone, or natural hair. They weren't dramatic, they were quiet, familiar, and now finally seen. One post showed a student in a hoodie standing outside a closed classroom door. "Got locked out of my senior seminar for wearing this." Next day, a white guy wore the same one, no comment. "I didn't yell, I just documented it," because silence doesn't mean surrender. Hatch from block to keynote. Another, they said my shoes weren't formal enough to enter the law school mixer. I left, changed, came back, and still got offered the internship. But I never forgot the first no. What Jasmine had done, without planning to, was offer a blueprint, not for confrontation, not for virality, for integrity. She didn't reject the system with rage. She exposed it with poise. And that's harder to dismiss. Because when a woman walks into a room she was told she couldn't enter, without raising her voice, without asking permission, and then becomes the reason the room falls silent, you don't forget her, and you don't forget the way you looked at her before you knew who she was. Somewhere the security guard who turned her away surely watched the speech. Maybe not live, maybe not all at once, but eventually curiosity cracks even the hardest armor. What did he see? Did he remember her face from that morning? Her quiet pause before she turned away? Did he recognize the weight of what he'd done? Not just the gatekeeping, but the ease with which it had been done. We'll never know, but it wasn't just about him. It never was. It was about the structure that made his response feel automatic, about the thousands of small denials that aren't violent, but routine. The subtle ways systems say, not you, not yet, not like that. And that's what made Jasmine's return so radical. She didn't fight the system on its terms. She showed up anyway, unchanged, unbent, undressed in everything but credibility. And that, perhaps, is the real threat. Someone who walks in with nothing the institution recognizes and still commands the room. Someone whose very existence breaks the rules of belonging and does it silently. In a grainy cell phone video taken just after the ceremony, Jasmine is seen standing off to the side of the stage, alone again. No entourage, no security detail, just her, sipping from a paper cup, looking out toward the now empty rows of white chairs. A few students pass, glancing her way. One hesitates, then approaches. "Ma'am, sorry, Ms. Crockett." Jasmine turns, warm but quiet. "Yes?" The girl's voice trembles. I just wanted to say thank you. You made me feel like I didn't have to keep explaining who I am. Like, maybe I can just be." Jasmine studies her for a beat. "You can," she says. "You already are." The girl tears up. Jasmine places a hand gently on her shoulder, then nods once. No big gesture, just a moment, just enough. Because that was the thread through it all, the choice to speak and the equal power of choosing when not to. Jasmine's silence at the gate didn't come from fear. It came from recognition. She knew what the guard saw when he looked at her, or rather what he didn't see. A robe, a lanyard, a uniform. But more than that, he didn't see status, didn't see title, didn't imagine she could be the one they were all waiting for. And instead of trying to convince him, she walked away. That choice wasn't weakness, it was calculation. And it was resistance in its most potent form, stillness. Because in America, particularly for Black women, silence is often misread, seen as passivity, or worse, submission. But what Jasmine revealed that day was a different kind of silence. Not retreat, not erasure, restraint. The kind of silence that says, I could argue, I could raise hell, but I don't need to, because truth is coming with me either way. And when she walked onto that stage, 10 minutes later, with no costume of power to shield her, just presence, it was clear. She had never been denied the space, only expected not to reach it. That expectation was the real uniform. The invisible garment stitched from decades of coded rules and unspoken judgments. About who gets to speak, who gets to lead, who gets to stand on platforms and redefine the air around them. And Jasmine shredded it without saying a word. Students called it the most powerful commencement moment they'd ever witnessed, not because of volume, but because of discipline, her stillness, her calm, her unshaken delivery. It wasn't performance, it was proof. Proof that dignity doesn't have to announce itself, it just enters. A media outlet later described her speech as eloquent, electric, and unexpected. But the line that caught fire wasn't even in her prepared remarks. It came from a student's caption. "You don't need to dress like them to deserve to lead them." It trended for days, printed on t-shirts, quoted in yearbooks, cited in op-eds. But more than anything, it echoed in the minds of students who had spent 4 years shaping themselves to fit into a version of respectability they never designed. Jasmine had broken that spell, not by attacking the structure, but by refusing to bend for it. And now, students weren't just watching her, they were emulating her. One law graduate walked across the stage barefoot, cords draped over her neck, but no shoes on her feet. When asked why, she said, "Because I've been walking on fire for years and no one noticed. Today I make them see it." Another wore a shirt under her gown that read simply, "This body belongs here." And one young man in a wheelchair refused the administration's pre-stage photo op. He waited, rolled himself across the stage alone, took his diploma his way. The image of Jasmine had done something deeper than go viral. It gave people permission, not to yell, not to rage, but to stand, to sit still in their truth until the world adjusted its frame. Because in that speech, unarmed by credentials, unshielded by robe, she showed them a different form of power. One that doesn't come from titles or traditions. One that isn't conferred. It's claimed. Somewhere in the city, a woman who'd never heard of Jasmine Crockett before last week was now sitting with her daughter, playing the video on a loop. The daughter, barely 12, watched in awe. "Mom," she whispered, "she looks like me." Her mother nodded. "She is you," she said. "Just older, just louder, just more ready." Outside that stadium, change didn't come with marching bands or banners. It came in the quiet, in the simple truth that a Black woman could be told she didn't belong and prove otherwise without ever raising her voice. The story stayed with them long after the lawn chairs were folded and the stage dismantled. Long after the hashtags slowed and the shares became archived memories. Because this wasn't the kind of story that fades, it lingers, not as scandal or sensation, but as a question. What does it really mean to belong? In the weeks that followed, Jasmine disappeared from headlines, not because she had vanished, but because she never needed the spotlight to stay relevant. She had said what she came to say, and the silence afterward, that deliberate withdrawal, was its own kind of punctuation. But her presence lingered, especially for the guard. We don't know his name, and maybe that's for the best. He didn't issue a public apology, didn't post a statement, but he did ask to be reassigned the following semester. Away from ceremony, away from gates. Some said he took early retirement. Others whispered he had written a letter. But none of that mattered as much as the truth he'd been forced to face. That the woman he turned away had not only belonged there, she had elevated the moment beyond anything the ceremony could have offered. And she did it without asking for his permission. In a student-led seminar titled Institutional Optics and Real Power, Jasmine's story was used as a case study. The professor, a soft-spoken woman with salt in her hair and fire in her words, posed a challenge. Who would have missed her if she hadn't found another way in? No one answered right away. She continued, "That's what systems are built to do, not reject outright, but forget you ever knocked. They function not by shouting no, but by never preparing space for your arrival." One student, a journalism major, raised her hand slowly. She made herself unforgettable. The professor nodded. "Exactly. That's power. Not because you forced your way in, but because you left no honest room for the world to pretend you weren't always meant to be there." A moment passed. Now ask yourselves, how many voices do we never hear because they don't come through the right entrance? That silence hung heavy. Back on social media, the hashtag slowed but never died. Instead, it evolved. From block to keynote came new variations. Still speaking, no gown, no permission, backdoor leadership, not slogans, markers, signals that something had changed in the consciousness of those who watched. In a video uploaded 2 months after the ceremony, a young woman stood in her dorm mirror wearing a plain black dress, no cords, no makeup, just a quiet voice speaking to the camera. This is for the girl who was told her look wasn't appropriate, who was told, "You don't seem like the speaker." This is for every time I dress to match expectations instead of meaning. From now on, I walk in like Jasmine did. No need to explain. She ended it with a single line. I know what I bring to the room. If they don't see it, that's their training. Not my problem. And that's what Jasmine had exposed. Not just bias, but training. The kind of unconscious sorting that happens 1,000 times a day. Too casual, too loud, too ethnic, too different, and too much. Until one person walks through anyway and proves the metric was never real. Because on that stage, stripped of every symbol institutions usually require, robe, title, pageantry, Jasmine had something rarer. Credibility without costume. And there's no dress code for that. Back at the university, a portrait of Jasmine was quietly installed in the School of Public Affairs. No plaque, no ceremony, just a still frame from her speech. Shoulders back, eyes forward, no regalia. It wasn't an act of tribute, it was a correction, a late, unspoken admission. We missed it the first time. We won't miss it again. Because the legacy of what she did doesn't live in headlines, it lives in posture. In the way a student now walks into an interview room, shoulders higher. In the way a young woman stands on a debate stage, no longer softening her edges. In the way silence now feels like strategy, not surrender. Jasmine never asked to be a symbol. She had simply come to deliver a speech. And the institution had tried subtly, quietly, confidently, to decide what she had to look like in order to be heard. But she had something more durable than approval. She had presence. And once you've seen what it looks like when a woman walks through the side door, unshaken and unbothered, and delivers a truth so grounded that the whole room forgets she was ever questioned, you don't unsee it, you carry it. Long after the applause fades and the hashtag's cool, what remains is the image, not of confrontation, not of spectacle, but of a woman who stood where she wasn't supposed to and didn't flinch. That stillness she carried at the gate, it never left her. It walked with her, right to the center of that stage. It wrapped itself around every word she spoke, every breath she took, every student who watched and quietly realized, I don't have to ask anymore. And maybe that's the takeaway. Not that Jasmine proved anyone wrong, but that she didn't wait to be proven right. She just showed up, unchanged, unapologetic, and unforgettable. Tell us what moment hit hardest. Share this story with someone who still thinks this never happens. Subscribe for stories that tell the truth, especially when it's uncomfortable. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative. Any resemblance to real events or individuals beyond public record is purely coincidental.